everyone, welcome to Prelims Warm Up. We'll be looking at 5 important previous year questions which had appeared in UPSC Prelims. This initiative has been brought to you by Aptiplus Academy for Civil Services, and my name is Shaikh Datta. I'm the faculty for Geography and Environment at Aptiplus Academy for Civil Services. So let us look at the 5 questions. First question is, and this question it has been taken from economics and it is from the year 2019. So the question is asking the money multiplier in an economy increases with which one of the following? The money multiplier in an economy increases with which one of the following? A. Increase in the cash reserve ratio. B. Increase in the banking habit of the population. C. Increase in the statutory liquidity ratio. And D. Increase in the population of the country. So when we talk about money multiplier, basically we get to see that banks, they will take deposits and then they will be able to generate more money by giving loans out of the deposits which are with the bank. So the depositors, they will deposit money in the bank, and from that money, the banks, they will be able to give out loans. So basically the same money will generate more money going forward. So when we talk about money multiplier in an economy, so which out of the following will help to increase the money multiplier? So out of the following we get to see it should be B, that is increase in the banking habit of the population. That is more the amount of money, more the amount of fund deposited by the people in the banks, that will lead to more amount of money being generated by the bank by giving loans out of that deposited fund. So ideally answer should be B. Let us look at the explanation part as well. So money multiplier, it is the ratio of the stock of money to the stock of high powered money. It is the ratio of the stock of money to the stock of the high powered money. That is the money which is present mainly in the deposits, which is not easily liquid. The relationship between the monetary base and the money supply of an economy. That is what is meant by money multiplier. It explains the increase in the amount of cash in circulation. It explains the increase in the amount of cash in circulation, which is generated by the bank's ability to lend money out of their depositors' funds. Okay? It explains the increase in the amount of cash in circulation, which is generated by the bank's ability to lend money out of their depositors' funds. Therefore, it refers to how an initial deposit can lead to a bigger final increase in the total money supply. Okay, so it talks about how an initial deposit can lead to a bigger final increase in the total money supply. That is what money multiplier basically indicates. For example, if the commercial banks, they gain deposits of rupees 1 lakh, and this leads to a final money supply of rupees 10 lakh, then the money multiplier, we will say that it is 10. Okay, so let's say 1 lakh is deposited, and from that the bank, it is able to generate money of around 10 lakhs by giving out loans to various agencies. Then we will say the money multiplier will be 10 in that economy. Okay, so this is with regards to the first question. The second question that we have is regarding PVTGs. PVTGs are the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. So this is mainly from the society part. So consider the following statements about particularly vulnerable tribal groups or PVTGs in India. So again, this question, it had appeared in the 2019 prelims. Let us see the first statement. The first statement is saying that the particularly vulnerable tribal groups, they reside in 18 states and 1 union territory. Now, is that correct? Yes, the particularly vulnerable tribal groups, we get to see that they reside in 18 states in India and 1 union territory, that is Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So first statement is correct. Second statement, a stagnant or declining population. A stagnant or declining population is one of the criteria for determining PVTG status. So basically, when we, from the name itself, you can understand the name itself is particularly vulnerable tribal group. So when will a tribal group become vulnerable? When their population is threatened. That is, there is a chance of the tribal community becoming extinct. So that when will that be possible? That will be possible if the rate of population growth is either 0 or negative for that particular tribal community. So the second statement, that a stagnant or declining population is one of the criteria for determining PVTG status, that is of course correct. The third statement, there are 95 PVTGs officially notified in the country so far. So that is incorrect because there are around 75 PVTGs and not 95. Okay. So the third statement is incorrect. And the fourth statement, Irula tribe and the Konda Reddy tribes. The Irula tribe and the Konda Reddy tribes, they are included in the list of PVTGs. Now, of course, you can understand there are around 75 PVTGs in India. It is not possible for you to remember all of these. But if some tribe has appeared in the papers, then ideally you should try to remember. In any case, let's say the Irula tribe, it is very famous for being very expert snake catchers. And they are also very primitive tribes. So if you are more or less aware about Irula tribe, you can probably mark this particular option or this particular statement also as correct. So ideally 1, 2 and 4 are correct, and the right answer should be C, 1, 2 and 4. So let us look at the explanation part. We get to see that there are 75 tribal groups which have been categorized by the Ministry of Home Affairs, and these 75 tribal groups, they have been categorized as PVTGs or particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Okay, so 75 tribal groups, they have been categorized by the Ministry of Home Affairs as the PVTGs or the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. These PVTGs, they reside in 18 states and Union Territory of Andaman Nicobar Islands, not Lakshadweep. Remember, it is Andaman Nicobar Islands only. The particularly vulnerable tribal groups, they are centrally recognized special category from among the scheduled tribes. So already, yes, they are definitely scheduled tribes, but within the scheduled tribe also, there will be certain tribal groups which are even more threatened than the rest of them. So they will be given the status of particularly vulnerable tribal group. Now, it was constituted during the fourth five-year plan on the basis of the report of a particular commission or a particular committee whose name is Dhebar Commission, DHEBAR. Remember the term Dhebar Commission whenever we talk about PVTGs, this particular commission, you should be able to recall that there was a particular commission whose name was Dhebar Commission around the 1960s. During the fourth five-year plan, it was constituted mainly to look into the PVTG. Okay, so it was constituted during the fourth five-year plan on the basis of the report of the Dhebar Commission. And such groups, they were identified by one or more of the following features. So either one or more of the following features should be present amongst a tribal community in order for them to get the status of a PVTG. So what are the kind of features that should be present? For example, existence of pre-agricultural practices. So these tribal groups, they should ideally be very primitive, and they should have certain features or characteristics which are usually found in the pre-agricultural era or the pre-agricultural age. Okay, so existence of pre-agricultural practices, that signifies that certain features, certain lifestyles which are usually seen in those tribes which are very, very primitive. Even they used to exist even before the agricultural age. So those kind of characteristics or features should ideally be present. Second, practice of hunting and gathering. As you might be aware that hunters and gatherers, they are usually very, very primitive tribes. So if this kind of a habit is present within the tribe, then there is a possibility that the tribe can be classified as a PVTG tribe. Similarly, another thing that was already mentioned in the question is zero or negative population growth. That is, either the population is stagnant or the population growth is actually negative in nature. So then also there is a chance for this particular tribal community to eventually become extinct, and hence they are given the status of a PVTG. Similarly, as might be expected from a primitive tribe, they should ideally be having a relatively low level of literacy as compared to the other tribal groups. Okay, so these are some of the features which are seen amongst the PVTGs. For example, the Konda Reddy tribe of Telangana, Khammam district of Telangana, and similarly Irula tribe, who usually are found around this Kerala, Tamil Nadu area, they of course are a part of the list of PVTGs. So where are these tribes found? Konda Reddy tribe, they are found in the Khammam district of Telangana, and we get to see the Irula tribe, who are usually found, though in the explanation I have mentioned it as Tamil Nadu, but they are usually found in the Western Ghats area, though mainly Kerala, Tamil Nadu area. Now, when a particular tribe is included amongst the PVTGs, it does not require a constitutional order. Okay, the inclusion of a tribe to the list of the PVTGs, it does not require a constitutional order. the government of India designed a procedure to identify the PBTGs. Now, according to the procedure, the state government or the union territory government, they are supposed to submit proposals to the Central Ministry of Tribal Welfare for identification of PBTGs. So how will the entire procedure take place? It is the state government or the union territory government who are supposed to submit proposals to the union government or to the central government, mainly the tribal ministry, okay, Central Ministry of Tribal Welfare, to identify the PBTGs. After ensuring that the criteria is fulfilled, the central ministry, it selects those groups as PBTGs. So if these groups which are nominated by the state government or by the union territory government, if they fulfill the criteria which are there for a PBTG, in that case, they are classified as a PBTG. And today we get to see that there are 75 PBTGs. There are 75 PBTGs as of today. The highest number of PBTGs, they are found in Odisha. How many are there? 13 PBTGs are found in Odisha. So remember the sequential order. Odisha, after that comes Andhra Pradesh, and then we have Bihar and Jharkhand together. So Bihar, Jharkhand together makes up around, or they comprise of around 9 PBTGs. So we have first one is Odisha, then comes Andhra Pradesh, then we have Bihar and Jharkhand together, and then we also have Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh together. Then we have Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Gujarat, all of them having 5 groups each, and finally we have West Bengal, Maharashtra, and Karnataka, Uttarakhand. But anyway, there are so many. What you have to remember particularly is this, at least the top 5. So Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, Bihar plus Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh plus Chhattisgarh, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Gujarat. So that's more than sufficient. Apart from that, we also get to see that all the 4 tribal groups which are present in the Andaman and Nicobar, so there are 4 groups in Andaman and 1 in Nicobar, all of them are recognized as PBTGs. Also, we get to see that in May 2018, the National Commission for Denotified Nomadic and Semi-Nomadic Tribes, whose chairman was Mr. Bhikhu Ramji Idate, has submitted its report. I mean, so that you are aware that there was such a commission, which is called as the National Commission for Denotified Nomadic and Semi-Nomadic Tribes. Just remember the name of the commission. The name of the commission is National Commission for Denotified Nomadic and Semi-Nomadic Tribes, and who's the chairman? Mr. Bhikhu Ramji Idate is the chairman, and he had submitted its report. So that is why this particular question came up in the UPSC 2019 prelims. Okay, so because this particular tribe or such kind of tribes, they were in the news, so that is why this particular question was asked. Moving on to the third question for today. With reference to the Constitution of India, the prohibition or limitations or provisions contained in ordinary laws cannot act as prohibitions or limitations on the constitutional powers under Article 142. What does it mean? Okay, I'll repeat once again. With reference to the Constitution of India, just examine this statement. What is the statement? The statement is saying prohibition or limitations or provisions contained in ordinary laws cannot act as prohibitions or limitations on the constitutional powers under Article 142 or 142. What does this particular statement imply? Let us see. Again, this is from Polity and Governance, asked in the year 2019. A. The decisions taken by the Election Commission of India while discharging its duties cannot be challenged in any court of law. So does this particular statement refer to this? The decisions taken by the Election Commission of India while discharging its duties cannot be challenged in any court of law. B. The Supreme Court of India is not constrained. The Supreme Court of India is not constrained in the exercise of its powers by laws made by the Parliament. C. In the event of grave financial crisis in the country, the President of India can declare financial emergency without the counsel from the Cabinet. And D. The state legislatures cannot make laws on certain matters without the concurrence of the Union legislature. Now, which of these is correct with regards to the statement which was provided in the question? So when we talk about prohibition or limitation or provisions contained in ordinary laws, they cannot act as prohibitions or limitations on the constitutional powers under Article 142. So Article 142 mainly talks about the Supreme Court. So over here, Option B should be the right answer. So let us see 3B. So Article 142, it states that the Supreme Court, in its exercise of its jurisdiction, may pass such decree or make such order as is necessary for doing complete justice in any cause or matter pending before it. So it can. So Article 142, what does it state? It states that the Supreme Court, in the exercise of its jurisdiction, may pass such decree or make such order as is necessary for doing complete justice in any cause or matter pending before it, and any decree so passed or orders so made shall be enforceable throughout the territory of India in such manner as may be prescribed by the Parliament. Now, until a provision in that behalf is made, then it would be enforced in such a manner as the President may by order prescribe. One of the important instances of application by the Supreme Court of Article 142 was in the Union Carbide case relating to the victims of the Bhopal gas tragedy. In this judgment, the Supreme Court, while awarding a compensation of $470 million to the victims, went to the extent of saying that to do complete justice, it could even override the laws made by Parliament by holding. Now you see this particular line appears now. So what did the Supreme Court say? Supreme Court said that during the Union Carbide, that is the Bhopal gas tragedy, which took place. So the Supreme Court, it awarded a compensation of around $470 million to the victims. Not only that, but it also went on to say that in order to provide complete justice, it can even override the laws which have been made by the Parliament. So what did it say? It said the exact same line, that prohibitions or limitations or provisions contained in ordinary laws cannot ipso facto, that is by the fact itself. Ipso facto basically means by the fact itself. Prohibitions or limitations or provisions contained in ordinary laws cannot ipso facto act as prohibitions or limitations on the constitutional powers under Article 142. By this statement, the Supreme Court of India placed itself above the laws made by Parliament or the legislatures of the states. Okay? So by this statement, the Supreme Court placed itself above the laws made by the Parliament or by the legislatures of the states. So the Supreme Court of India is not constrained in the exercise of its powers by the laws made by the Parliament. So it can even override the laws made by Parliament. For example, we get to CK. There have been some important cases where the Supreme Court has invoked Article 142 to override the laws made by the Parliament. For example, appointment of Lokayukta in Uttar Pradesh. For example, setting up of R.M. Lodha Committee to oversee the functioning of the Medical Council of India, which was corruption ridden. Transfer the trial of accused in the Babri Masjid demolition case, or ban on the sale of alcohol within 500 meters of state and national highways, and the Witness Protection Scheme 2018. So in all these cases, the Supreme Court had invoked the provisions under Article 142. Okay. So now let us move on to the fourth question, and the fourth question that we get to see, that is also with regards to polity and governance, with reference to the Legislative Assembly of a state in India. With reference to the Legislative Assembly of a state in India, consider the following statements. First statement is, the governor makes a customary address to members of the House at the commencement of the first session of the year. The governor makes a customary address to the members of the House at the commencement of the first session of the year. Is that correct? Yes, definitely. The first statement is correct. The second statement, when a state legislature does not have a rule on a particular matter, it follows the Lok Sabha rule on that matter. Is that correct? Just let us read it once again. When a state legislature does not have a rule on a particular matter, it follows the Lok Sabha rule on that matter. Is that correct? Answer is no. That is because we get to see that under, I think, Article 208, it says that when a state legislature does not have a rule on a particular matter, then whatever rule was already existing prior to the adoption of the constitution in that particular province, in that particular state, that will continue. So it is not that the state legislature will follow the Lok Sabha rule on that matter. That is not correct. So only the first statement ideally should be correct. Answer should be A1 only. So yes, answer is A. And let us look at the explanation part. Article 176 part 1 of the Constitution of India it enjoins that the governor shall address both the houses assembled together at the commencement of the first session after each general election to the assembly and at the commencement of the first session of each year, and inform the legislature of the causes of its summon. So Article 176 part 1 of the Constitution of India, it talks about the fact that the governor, it shall address both the houses. So if it's a bicameral legislature, so in that case you will have both the legislative assembly as well as the council. So both the assembly and the council are assembled together, and that is when the governor will address both of them at the commencement of the first session after each general election to the assembly. So once the general election to the assembly has taken place, then during the first session, the governor will address both the houses together. This is one of the cases in which the governor will address both the houses. The other case where the governor addresses both the houses, that is at the commencement of the first session of each year. Commencement of the first session of each year, and it will inform the legislature of the causes of its summons, so why it has been summoned. The address of the governor contains a review of the activities and achievements of the government during the previous year and their policy with regard to important internal problems, as well as a brief account of the program of the government business for this particular session. So these are the things which are contained in that particular address. So what are the main things? The address of the governor will contain a review of the activities and achievements of the government during the previous year, and also their policy with regard to important internal problems, as well as a brief account of the program of government business for that particular session. Similarly, to address the second part of the question, Article 208 in the Constitution of India 1949, what does it say? It talks about the rules of procedure in the House, and basically it says that a house of the legislature of a state, the house of a legislature of a state may make rules for regulating subject to the provisions of this constitution, its procedure, and the conduct of its business. So a house, that is the legislature of a state, can make rules for these to the provisions of its constitution, its procedure, and the conduct of its business. But until the rules are made under clause 1, that is the first clause as was mentioned, until and unless such kind of rules are made on such subjects by the legislature of the state, the rules of procedure and the standing orders which are already in force immediately before the commencement of the constitution with respect to the legislature for the corresponding province shall have the effect in relation to the legislature of the state, subject to such modifications and adaptations as may be made therein by the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly or by the Chairman of the Legislative Council, as the case may be. So in a nutshell, basically what does it say? It says that until a house, that is a legislature of a state, let's say, until a house has made rules of procedure for a particular subject, till then those rules which were applicable just immediately before the commencement of the constitution, those rules will still be in force. Those rules will still apply. Okay, so those rules which were being followed immediately before the commencement of the constitution, those rules, they will still be applicable, but they might be modified according to the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly or the Chairman of the Legislative Council. According to the decisions that they make, there can be some modifications of the same, but till the time rules are made by the House, those pre-existing rules, those will still continue. And we get to see that this is the third part of this Article 208, which says that in a state having a legislative council, the governor, after consultation with the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly and the Chairman of the Legislative Council, may make rules as to the procedure with respect to communications between the two houses. Hence, there is no mention that the State Assembly will follow the Lok Sabha rule. So, if you go through the entire Article 208 of Indian Constitution, there are three parts of it. So, you have part 1, 2, and 3. In neither of these parts do we get to see anywhere it is written that the State Assembly will follow the Lok Sabha rule in case there is no rule on a particular subject. So the second statement is incorrect. The first statement is only correct, and we get to see for question number 4, the right answer should be A1 only. Moving on to the last question for the day, question number 5, and this is a question which was in the news. So it was a current affairs question, but again it's good that we should be knowing about it. So let's just have a look at this particular question, which was again asked in the year 2019, and it is related to some bodies of the United Nations. So there are 4 statements which have been given, and we have to consider the 4 statements and say which out of them are correct. So first statement is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption, or UNCAC. United Nations Convention Against Corruption, or UNCAC, it has a protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea and air. Okay. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, it has a protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea and air. That is your first statement. The second statement, United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, is the first ever legally binding global anti-corruption instrument. It is the first ever legally binding global anti-corruption instrument. Now, is that correct? Yes. First statement is not correct, because the first statement talks about the fact that it is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption which has a protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea and air. That is not correct, because the United Nations Convention Against Corruption does not deal with the smuggling of migrants by land, sea and air. So the first statement is incorrect. The second statement, that UNCAC, or the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, is the first ever legally binding global anti-corruption instrument, that is correct. The third statement is a highlight of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. I'll repeat once again the name, the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, or UNTOC, is the inclusion of a specific chapter aimed at returning assets to their rightful owners from whom they had been taken illicitly. Okay, so one of the highlights of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime is the inclusion of a specific chapter aimed at returning assets to their rightful owners from whom they had been taken illicitly. And the fourth statement that we have, the fourth statement, that United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, is mandated by its member states to assist in the implementation of both UNCAC and UNTOC. So the fourth statement is actually correct, that the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, or UNODC, that is mandated by its member states to assist in the implementation of both United Nations Convention Against Corruption as well as United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, UNTOC. So 2 and 4 are correct. Now let us examine the other statements. Okay, first statement is incorrect. Let us look at the third statement. Now first statement is not correct, as we have already discussed, and the second statement is correct, because the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, or UNCAC, which entered into force in December 2005, it is the first ever binding global anti-corruption instrument. It is the first ever binding global anti-corruption instrument. So the second statement is correct. And what does it do? It obliges the states, that is the member nations, it obliges the states to prevent and criminalize different corrupt practices, to promote international cooperation, cooperate for the recovery of stolen assets, and enhance technical assistance and information exchange. Let us again see what UNCAC does. It obliges the states to prevent and criminalize different corrupt practices, promote international cooperation, cooperate for the recovery of stolen assets, and enhance the technical assistance and information exchange. So you see over here the third statement that we have, that a highlight of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime is the inclusion of a specific chapter aimed at returning assets to the rightful owners from whom they had been taken illicitly. So this is not a part of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So this is not a part of UNTOC. Rather, this particular thing, that is the inclusion of a chapter aimed at returning assets to their rightful owners from whom it has been taken illicitly, this is actually a part of UNCAC, not UNTOC. Understood? So that is why this third statement is also incorrect. The first statement is also incorrect. Only 2 and 4 are correct. So answer should be C, 2 and 4. But anyway, let us look at the explanation part again. Statement 3 is also not correct. The UNTOC that was adopted, that is the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, UNTOC. It was adopted by the General Assembly in the year 2000 and it came into force in 2003. The convention is the first comprehensive and global legally binding instrument to fight transnational organized crime. States that have ratified the UNTOC commit themselves to taking a series of measures to prevent and control transnational organized crime. What kind of measures? For example, number one, the criminalizing of the participation in an organized criminal group of money laundering, related corruption, and obstruction of justice. Similarly, adoption of framework for extradition, mutual legal assistance, and international cooperation. So UNTOC is mainly concerned with all this. Okay, it is the first comprehensive and global legally binding instrument to fight transnational organized crime. States which have ratified this UNTOC, they commit themselves to taking a series of measures to prevent and control transnational organized crime. What kind of measures? For example, the criminalizing of the participation in an organized criminal group. Similarly, money laundering, corruption, obstruction of justice, all of these have, the member states, they have to criminalize all of these activities. Similarly, the adoption of framework for extradition, mutual legal assistance, and international cooperation, these are also some of the measures which need to be taken by the member states. Plus, we also get to see that this UNTOC is further supplemented by 3 protocols. So, UNTOC, or the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, UNTOC, it is further supplemented by three protocols which target specific forms of organized crime. Okay, so what are these 3 protocols which are present under UNTOC? Number 1, the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. It provides an agreed upon definition of trafficking in persons. So please remember that the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish the trafficking in persons, especially that of women and children, so that is a part of your UNTOC and not UNCAC. It provides an agreed upon definition of trafficking in persons. It aims at comprehensively addressing trafficking in persons through the so-called 3 Ps. Okay, how do you address? So UNTOC, under that there are 3 protocols, and one of the protocol deals with the trafficking of persons, especially that of women and children, and it says that how this particular problem it can be dealt with. So there are there are 3 Ps. Number 1, that is prosecution of perpetrators. So whoever is doing this crime, dealing in the trafficking of women and children, so they have to be prosecuted. That is first. Similarly, second is the protection of the victims. So until and unless you protect the victims, they will not be in a position to say things or say things against the guilty persons. Okay, so prosecution of perpetrators, that is number 1. Second is the protection of victims. Third is prevention of trafficking. So these are the 3 ways in which you can deal with the problem of trafficking of women and children. The second protocol that is under UNTOC, let us look at it. The protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air. Okay, the protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air, that also provides a definition of the smuggling of migrants. The protocol aims at preventing and controlling smuggling of migrants, promoting cooperation among the state parties while protecting the rights of the smuggled migrants. The last protocol that is there, that is the protocol against the illicit manufacturing and trafficking in firearms, their parts and components, and ammunition. It promotes and facilitates and strengthens cooperation among the state parties in order to prevent and control the illicit manufacturing of and trafficking in firearms, their parts, and components, and also ammunition, by mainly committing the member states to introduce solid registration and storage systems for all legally produced arms. Okay, so ये जो तीनों protocols है under UNTOC, the first one deals with the trafficking of persons, especially that of women and children. The second one deals with the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, or air. And the third protocol that is there, that is against the illicit manufacturing and trafficking of firearms, their parts, their components, as well as ammunition. So statement 4 is correct. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, it is mandated by its member states to assist in the implementation of both the conventions, that is UNCAC as well as UNODC. So we get to see that this particular body, that is the UNODC, or the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, it is supposed to assist in the implementation of both these conventions, that is UNTOC as well as UNCAC. So United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, remember this one, and the other one is UNTOC, so United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And please remember, it is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime which implements both of these conventions. So this particular question was a little bit on the difficult side, mainly because it's very difficult for a person to go so deep and to know each of the protocols under a convention. So with this, we complete the 5 previous year questions for today, and hope you have liked this video. If you have, then please like, comment, and subscribe to Aptiplus's YouTube channel, and stay tuned for more such informative videos. We will be back with another episode of Prelims Warm Up. So till then, stay safe, study hard, and thank you so much.
I'm an icon, man. And my girl about a 10. I should fuck her in a Benz.